Okay, so if you just bought an SRS or an HTI, the most important decision you have next is what scope to buy. Now, we're going to go over the features of different scopes to kind of help educate our customer base to be able to not have to buy more than one scope. I remember when I first got into long distance hunting or long distance shooting, then I bought 8 to 10 different scopes before I finally found exactly what I wanted and really knew what features really mattered. So usually when somebody goes to buy a scope, then they're focused on the magnification, how powerful they can have their magnification. And a lot of guys think, if I buy a 30 power scope, then I don't have to buy a spotting scope and I can just observe through my optic. There's a lot of problems with that we'll go over. One of them being that as your magnification goes up, your elevation travel is reduced. And then another really common theme that people are real excited about when they go shopping for a scope is to buy the best glass that is available. They really want to have a crisp, sharp image, and I can appreciate that. But honestly, the magnification and the sharpness of the image is not as important as your elevation and windage adjustments. So on a scope, you have your elevation knob, which is this top knob here, and you have your windage knob, which is on the side. For me, I run a 338 Lapua, and I like to be able to shoot out to 2,000 yards without having to hold over on my reticle, which means that I need a scope that has a lot of elevation travel. To be able to have that kind of elevation travel, you need about 100 minutes of angle inside of an MOA scope, and in a mil scope, you need the same equivalency, which is, it's about 20 to 24, 25 mils. And then if you can have that kind of travel, you really can make that shot at a long distance, but you can still get a 100-yard zero. Now, I went through a bunch of scopes over the years that didn't have accurate click values. And so you want the click values to equal what they say they're supposed to equal. I remember I bought several scopes that had 0.4 MOA clicks, and they were supposed to be half MOA clicks, which was really problematic because I had my ballistic calculator that was giving me my drop tables in half MOA increments, but it screwed everything up. My predictions were off, and I didn't really understand why until I went out and I validated the click value on the range. The other theme that you really want to look for besides the accuracy of the clicks on your scope is I call them high travel turrets. And so, I used to run a night force that had, I think it was like 10 minutes of angle per rotation. And every time I shot out to 2,000 yards, then I had to turn the knob, 6 or 7 rotations. And I would get off a rotation and it caused me a lot of misses. As I went back and forth between shooting different distances, because I would lose my place on the dial, then I made a lot of misses, and it really bothered me. And so I look for scopes that have a high travel knob, which essentially means in one rotation of the knob, you can shoot out from 100 yards to about 1,300 yards before you hit that second revolution. And the scopes that I prefer the most have an indicator to show you once you get to the second revolution. And so on this collis here, as I rotate and I get to the second rotation, it's got this red flag up on top of the scope. Or the Schmidt and Bender that I have here, as I go to that second rotation, this center section here pops up, and it makes it really nice because if you're reading your numbers and the flag is not popped up, then you're on the first row of numbers. If the flag's popped up, you're on the second row of numbers, and the probability of losing your place on the dial is dramatically reduced. And so for me, that's an extremely important feature, because I've shot a lot and people say, well, I don't ever lose my place on the dial. And it's funny because you get them into a precision rifle class, and the first thing they're doing is losing their place on the dial as you go back and forth. The second most important feature for me is the placement of the reticle. There's two positions that you can have your reticle in the scope. One of them is called front focal plane. So in your rifle scope, your magnification adjustment is in this area between the magnification knob and the turret. And so as you rotate this, a lens will slide back and forth, and that'll increase or decrease your magnification. Now, if you have a front focal plane reticle, then that means your reticle is right in this area of the turret. And as you increase or decrease that magnification ring, then the reticle is also magnified. And so essentially, visually, the reticle will grow if it's in the front focal plane. And some people don't like that because their argument is, the crosshair gets thicker, so my precision gets decreased. And so they prefer a rear focal plane reticle. And so if you get a rear focal plane reticle, that means that your crosshair is located behind your magnification ring back here. And so as you increase or decrease the magnification, the reticle visually stays the same size. But I really, really hate rear focal plane, and here's why. As you're shooting and you learn to use your adjustments on your reticle, your mil scale or your MOA adjustments on your reticle, you want the value of those subtensions and those lines to remain the same at every single magnification. And so as you magnify a target and that target visually gets bigger, you want your crosshair to also visually get bigger so that those subtensions remain the same value. Otherwise, you will, with a rear focal plane reticle, your target grows, but your subtensions appear to be smaller because your target's big and your subtensions are still small, and so you don't have you lost your accuracy of your subtensions. And I got an example of what happens when you're using a rear focal plane reticle. I was hunting with a buddy of mine, and he had a Night Force 5-22, and he loved using holdovers. So he had his center of his crosshair was set at his 600-yard zero. Because the value of his reticle was only accurate at 22 power magnification, he had it cranked up to 22 power, and we were elk hunting, and I shot an elk about 200-300 yards away, and it went down. And so we're walking over there together and to go take care of this elk, and we passed this spruce tree, and there's a cow elk standing like 15 yards away from us, and he pulls up on this cow elk, and he's on 22 magnification, so he can't see anything. So he puts his rifle down, zooms all the way down, pulls it up, uses his quick holdover, but because he was now at 5 power magnification, it was 4 times different than what it was supposed to be, and he shot and he missed the elk. And I laughed at him. I said, you could have shot this elk from the hip without bringing your rifle up at all. But after that, I had sold him on using a front focal plane reticle, because had he had a front focal plane reticle, then he would not have missed that elk. The next part is to make sure that the value of the clicks in your scope match the value in the crosshair. So the US military for years and years and years had scopes with MOA turrets and mil reticles, which is nuts, because if those values are different, you have to do a conversion formula on the range, and it wastes a lot of time, and it's really slow. If you have a scope that has MRAD or mil turrets, you want a reticle that's mil. If you have a scope that's MOA turrets, you want a reticle that's MOA. And if you do that, it's really awesome, because as you're shooting on the range and you let's say you shoot at 800 yards and you miss the target, you hit low. Well, you can actually measure how much your miss was with your crosshair. And so you put your crosshair on the center of the target, and then you use your scale to measure how far low you were. And let's say that you're 1.2 mils low. Well, you got two options at this point. You can either aim 1.2 mils higher with your crosshair, or you can just dial 1.2 with your turret. And it's extremely fast and convenient to have them match. Now, it doesn't matter if you are a part of the MRAD club or if you're a part of the MOA club, just as long as you know the measurement scale that you prefer. Myself, I like MRAD, and the only reason that I prefer MRAD is because it comes in 0.1 MRAD clicks, which is about 0.33 MOA. And by having 0.33 MOA, then I can have a very high travel turret that still has fine enough adjustments that if I'm shooting 2,000 yards, then my click value isn't going to cause me to miss because it is too coarse. I found with half MOA turrets that click value was a little bit too coarse for my liking once I got to 1,500 plus yards. So we talked about elevation and windage, and we talked about the reticle. And so, I mean, the magnification of the scope is what we'll cover next. This is, like I said, is usually the first thing that people want to focus on is how high of a magnification they can get. I don't really like magnification over 20 power. So this Collis goes up to 24 power, which is okay. But the reason I don't like magnification over 20 power is because once you hit that 20 power limit, then mirage really starts to be a big problem. Now, if you don't know what mirage is, it's heat waves. And so if you've ever had a low resolution digital camera and you took a picture and the picture looked really great, and then you tried to blow that picture up and you made it bigger, and then it just looked like a big blurry mess. Well, that's what mirage does. So if you have that mirage present on the range, once you get up past 17 to 20 power, that mirage doesn't really give you better resolution at all. It just makes it look like that digital photo that's more blurry. And so 20 power is really, kind of my ideal top end. I would rather shoot at 17 power than 24 power. And so, yeah, most of the time on the range when I'm shooting, I find that optimal resolution magnification is somewhere around 17 power. As far as the low end of the magnification, I really like a low end because I hunt. And, like the example that I used with my buddy out elk hunting, where, he had to magnify his scope to a lower range to be able to see this elk at 15 yards, that happens a lot. And so I really prefer a low end that's, I really like the 3 power as a low end. This one goes down to 6 power. Collis has a new 3 to 18 that I think is really awesome because it is really short and compact and has all the other bells and whistles. Some of the other things to know about scopes is the objective lens diameter. And so people really think the bigger the objective lens, the more light and the brighter the picture is going to be. And they're right to a sense, but only so much light can actually reach your eye. So there's a point of diminishing returns. I do not like scopes larger than a 56 millimeter objective because it just starts to get too high off of the rifle. I prefer, somewhere around 50 millimeter lens. 56 is okay, but 50 millimeter lens for me is really nice because it still keeps the scope nice and compact. Now, the tube diameter. Some people believe that having a 30 millimeter tube or a 34 millimeter tube will transmit more light through the scope, and it doesn't. The reason for the different tube sizes is for elevation travel. So if you have a 34 millimeter tube, you can actually get more elevation travel out of your scope versus a 1-inch tube. It restricts the movement of that crosshair. And I mentioned that your crosshair sits up in here, and there's a small tube in there, and as you adjust it, then that overall tube diameter is what allows that to go up and down inside of the tube. The other feature on scopes is their parallax adjustment. So you have your parallax adjustment that focuses downrange. This Collis parallax adjustment is on the elevation turret right here. The Schmidt and Bender parallax adjustment is on the side. In the old days, you know, all the adjustments for parallax was found on the objective lens, which I really hated because it was very, very difficult to reach in the prone position. And so the side parallax adjustment or top parallax adjustment is really nice. I don't care for lit reticles. I don't use lit reticles. I've shot with night vision and thermals and all the, you know, the fun toys, and I've never found a need for a lit reticle. And so I don't use them. If you want them, great. I really don't care for lit reticles. I think it's a feature that just makes the scope cost more money that it doesn't need to be there. You have your ocular focus. Now this focuses the crosshair, and so some people will, you know, try to focus the image downrange and they'll focus their crosshair, and vice versa. So if you have a blurry crosshair, you know, you adjust the crosshair focus right here. If you have a blurry image downrange, you adjust it right here. And so I'm not going to go into how to set those. We can teach you how to do some of that stuff later. Some of the additional features that some of the higher end scopes have that you know, the U.S. military really likes is, like on the Schmidt & Bender, they have lockable turrets. And the reason they have lockable turrets is because in rough handling conditions, in field conditions, it's really easy to bump your knob and actually spin it off of your zero setting. And then you go to engage a target and you miss, which is a very dangerous situation to be in. I was in a sniper competition one time, and they had us shooting low prone underneath this cement barricade. And as I climbed down underneath this position, it was so low you couldn't actually get your bipod deployed on your rifle. So as I climbed underneath this position, then the barricade actually rolled across my scope. You know, it just pushed on my scope and it turned it off about 6 mils, and I didn't know because it was a time fire and I was in a hurry, and I shot, and it was a 600-yard target, easy shot, and I was missing and I couldn't figure out why. And then after this, you know, the time ran out with no hits on target, I was analyzing my kit back behind the firing line, and I noticed that had happened. So but the lockable turrets is a pretty cool feature. Sometimes it makes it a little bit more cumbersome to actually use the scope though, and so it's really depends on what your needs are. You know, if for a rugged competition or a field worthy optic, then I would definitely opt for the lockable turrets if you can. Lens quality is really a nice thing to have. You know, it's the difference between resolving bullet impacts at range versus not being able to resolve them. I'm not going to go into the different grades of optical lenses. I'll just tell you right now, you know, some of the best scopes on the planet with the best lens quality are Swarovski, Collis, Schmidt & Bender. Some of Night Force's high-end stuff has really got some nice lenses. You know, those are probably the most common brands that I'm familiar with. Once you kind of find what you like, you don't really test other optics anymore. So everything else that I really shot outside of those has been several years since I've really been on there. So we talked about all of the specs really that are on paper for the most part. Understand that paper is limited, because as you buy a scope and you go and you test it, you know, for click accuracy, you test it for, you know, reticle, unnecessary reticle movements, you're going to find that there's some problems. Like there's an optic that I tested a while back. As I adjusted the parallax at different distances, then it was so, I don't know what you want to call it, so sensitive that if I wasn't focused at the specific distance that I was wanting to look at something, then the side picture would actually like turn into a big blur and the target would become invisible and it just looked like a big glass bowl. And so that was really bad. And so you want to, with your parallax, even if it's not focused specifically on a specific distance, you want to still be able to at least see a target out there, even if it's blurry. Just for obvious reasons. And then sometimes the eye box, the eye relief is so sensitive that you really have to have your head in exactly the certain distance to even be able to see an image, or else it turns into a glass bowl. Again, you don't want that. You want it to have a forgiving eye box that you can still easily see through the scope, even if your distance of your eye is not set perfectly. One of the things that we discovered as we did optics testing on some brands of scopes is as you adjust the parallax, then the crosshair actually would move. And I'm not going to say what brand it was, because it was an older model of their optic, but it was really frustrating because, you know, I had actually used their scopes for a lot of years, and as you're shooting distance and you're using your ballistics and trying to predict your trajectory, and you are missing and you don't know why. You know, why is my ballistics calculator giving me different results than what I'm actually experiencing? And when you have a parallax adjustment that as you adjust from from the minimum to the maximum parallax, I mean, the crosshair was moving 5 minutes of angle. 5 minutes of angle. And it wasn't, you know, just in a certain area, but it was through the whole range. It would just steadily move up 5 minutes of angle through that whole range all the way to the end, which really frustrated me. And I sold all of those optics, because if you have unnecessary or uncontrolled movement of the reticle, you cannot have predictive fire accuracy. Most all scopes will have some movement of the crosshair when you adjust the parallax, but usually it's only at 50 meters and closer. And so if you have a little bit of reticle movement at 50 meters and closer, it's not a big deal. It's close enough that you're going to still hit your target, but you definitely don't want reticle movement once you increase your parallax range above 50 meters. So that's a pretty comprehensive summary of what features to look for in a scope and what each of the features accomplish. You know, this Collis is around $3,000. The Schmidt & Bender's even more than that. And I'm not telling you to go out and buy, you know, the premium best of the best scopes. That doesn't make any sense. But what you can do is you can find these features, you know, the high travel turret, the front focal plane reticle, in a lot of budget scopes, from Night Force, from Vortex Optics. And it's more important to get on the range with a scope that has, you know, these good features than it is to not get on the range at all. And so if you're buying a $900 Vortex with a little bit less elevation travel and front focal plane reticle, great. You know, we sell the PSD scopes from Vortex to a lot of customers because it gets them shooting, and it gets them shooting fast. And then you can upgrade to something higher end in the future. Now, one of the common mistakes that folks make once they buy their scope is they don't really know how to put it on their rifle effectively. Now, you want to taper your scope and put it in a set of rings or on a Picatinny rail that's actually tapered. So if you have a scope with 100 MOA travel, then to be able to use all 100 MOA, you can only accomplish that if you put it on a tapered scope base. Otherwise, you're going to cut it in half. And if you think about it, the crosshair centered in the tube, if the scope is parallel with the barrel, then you're only going to have half of your adjustment up. So a 100-minute scope gives you 50 minutes of angle up. Now, if I want to use all of that travel in the scope, what I'll do is I'll divide it in half. So I'm going to lose 50 minutes of angle, and then I'll look at whatever scope taper base is the closest to that doesn't exceed that. So I don't want a 60-minute taper base because I won't be able to get 100 yard zero. And I also don't want to have a 50-minute base because I'm still probably not going to get 100 yard zero. So I would go no closer to 5 minutes of angle of taper. So I guess the extreme taper that I would use in that scenario would be a 45-minute base. Most people don't sell 45-minute of angle bases. We produce a 40-minute of angle base, and so I use a 40 for that. And so if you have 100 minutes of travel, then a 40-minute base will allow you to utilize, what is that? It's 50 plus 40 is 90 minutes of angle. Awesome. Tons of elevation travel. Now, if you have a scope, let's say it was 65 minutes of angle, you divide that in half and you get 32 minutes of angle. I would not opt for a 30-minute base. I would go to a 20-minute base, again, because you don't want to be bumping up against the the tube housing trying to get 100-yard zero. Some other just quick tips is I really like using a bubble level on my gun. So I actually have 3 different bubble levels. There's one that comes in the scope rings, but I have a hard time seeing that from the shooting position. I got this $10 burst, really awesome, and then I got this Horus slope cant indicator, and I use this for the to be able to measure my slope, and then I use the burst to be able to measure my canting. The reason I like a scope level is because we have a lot of mountains out here and we don't have flat horizons to really reference from. And so if you are shooting with your gun canted, it's going to throw your shots left or right. When you're shooting 1,500 yards, a little bit of cant is really going to screw up your shot. And so I really like running a bubble level for that. Anyhow, so that concludes the, I guess, Scopes 101. To help customers not make a mistake and have to buy 10 different scopes before they find what they really want to use and what really works. We'll continue to give you guys tips and teach you guys how to accessorize your precision rifles and your MDR in the future. So if you want to stay tuned for those things, subscribe to the channel, like the video if you did. If you have any comments or suggestions, drop those down below. And thanks.